Good evening. Welcome to PoliticIt Podcast. We're going to do something a little different today. We've got Dan Peterson with us from the Interpreter Foundation, and then Russ Richens. Mm-hmm. And why don't you tell us a little bit, the audience a little bit about both of you? Because I know people are familiar with you, but let's just talk a little bit about your backgrounds. I know, Dan, you were a BYU professor.
I was, yeah. I retired just 2 or 3 years ago, and I was a professor of Islamic studies and Arabic at BYU. So this is a really different thing than what I was doing at that time. But I retired. I've been involved with the Interpreter Foundation since we founded it in 2012, and so that's really kind of my almost full-time thing now, is running this nonprofit foundation that we do. And the reason that I'm here with Russ is that one of the things that we do at Interpreter, we publish a weekly online journal and so on and so forth, but we've also gotten into making movies. And Russ is the producer of the major films that we've done.
Thank you. And I'm just an Idaho farm boy who discovered his way into the film industry and live and recorded entertainment. And there's a lot more to that story. But
yeah. So what? The film I saw before, The Witnesses, right? You were involved with that, and that's another Interpreter Foundation film. And then this one, 6 Days in August. Yeah. What a kind of an amazing story.
Yeah.
Very much so. Very much so.
Yeah, we just began to realize that a lot of people, frankly, don't read books, and we wanted to reach people where they are. And we thought one way of reaching them with these really powerful stories is via film. So we want to go wherever people are and try to get the message out to them. So we'll do almost anything within reason and good morals to reach people with the message that we want them to hear.
Yeah. So what was the motivation for this film?
Well, it seemed a logical follow-up in a way to Witnesses. I mean, Witnesses tries to answer the question, was God involved in the events of the Restoration, those early formative events? And I think the testimony of the Witnesses is probably the single most powerful evidence that we have that, yes, there was deity involved in this. But then it occurred to me, what if you've accepted Joseph Smith, the Restoration, the Book of Mormon, and so on and so forth, you're fine, and then Joseph is killed. Now what do? There are various claimants, eventually quite a few, to the leadership of the church. And so you're satisfied on Joseph and the Book of Mormon and the Restoration, but now you face another dilemma, another fork in the road where you have to make a choice. And so I thought that was a crucial story to tell. And so we've tried to tell the story of August 1844. That's the August in the title, when the saints have a decision between Sidney Rigdon and the 12, led by Brigham Young, because they've never had an experience like this. Most of them probably never even imagined Joseph could die, or let alone what they would do, what would be the procedure when he was gone. Where do we go now? So that question seems to us a really, really important one, and it's a great dramatic story.
Well, it was unique because you go back in time, right?
Correct.
With Brigham Young, because you want to kind of develop his character.
Yeah.
I didn't even know, and I'm sure a lot of people did. I didn't know that Angel was not his first wife.
Right.
That was actually, I thought, that doesn't. Why is her name Angel? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
there was part of that I had a little bit of a hard time following, but it was important to the development of his character, right?
Yeah. I think it's important to show Brigham Young because a lot of people have the image of him as this stern disciplinarian. The pictures of him he's 70, late 70s. But he was a young man at one point, and he was a young widower raising 2 orphan children, and it shows a different side of Brigham Young. He was apparently a very caring father and devoted. He tended to Miriam, his first wife, during a long illness, and that's a side of him that I think isn't appreciated.
Yeah. Well, that was unique to go back in time there.
Right.
I think some people, I've read some of the reviews, some people were having a hard time following, well, now we're going back in time, right? You're developing Brigham Young, and so what was some of the motivation for doing that?
Okay. Going back in time, we actually, in the editing process, you experiment a lot. And we discovered that the arrangement that we have now is the best arrangement to be able to introduce what the crisis is and that to establish that Joseph Smith and Hiram have been killed. And so, but then by jumping back, you've got to, as you said, you've got to understand the background of Brigham and the relationship between Brigham and Joseph. And there was literally, they were two men who loved each other, and Brigham was extremely faithful. And so we felt that it was really, really important that you understand that. And as we experimented with the timeline, whether to put intersperse those 6 days in August throughout the film or to put them at the end, we found that the best reaction from the audience was to put them at the end. It worked well. And it's a vehicle that's used, if I can use that term, that's a technique that is used in filmmaking all the time. Introduce what's happening, go back in time and bring us back up to that event, and then push forward.
So it starts out, and this was kind of interesting to me because, it starts out with Brigham speaking in tongues, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's shocking to some people, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And I don't, I always knew that was the case in that particular case, but it was an interesting scene right at the first of the.
Yeah.
Very much so.
And some people have come to me and said, "Now you made that up." No, we didn't. That's in some early sources, and we wanted to show again this. I grew up with the notion that Brigham was the great organizer, but maybe not very spiritual. No, he spoke in tongues several times. And that story with the oxen is one of those occasions. So it shows, again, a different side of Brigham than we've normally thought of.
Well, and then you bring that forward when he meets Joseph Smith, right? And Joseph Smith basically says,
yeah,
Yep.
this is real,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. That power of discernment, really, really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the gifts, right?
Yeah.
Of the Spirit.
Exactly right.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that attracted to Brigham. He attracted Brigham to the church, I should say, was that he wanted a church that he thought fulfilled the biblical requirements, and this one did.
Yeah, and as most people know, Brigham Young didn't just jump into the church.
No.
He investigated for 2 years, I believe
Yeah.
it was, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, 2 years.
He wanted to know, he said, if good sense was manifest among the Mormonites. And when he concluded these were solid people, it was good people, and there really was a prophet, he was all in.
So how did he become the senior apostle?
Well, Thomas Marsh originally was the senior apostle, but he apostatized. And Brigham and Heber, at one point, I think it's Amos Lyman who says, basically, that Brigham and Heber were the only two who had never faltered in the original 12. And so he rises to the leadership of the 12 because he's the oldest. That's actually mentioned. Lyman
Right.
White mentions that in the film. But it's striking. There's a book by Eugene England, sort of a famous Latter-day Saint. People think of him as a dissident, but he was actually a deep believer. And he makes a really interesting point. He says, you can see in the records of the British mission how Brigham Young is initially just nominally the head of the 12, but gradually all the other apostles begin to refer to him as the president. I mean, he has earned it, and they all recognize he's the leader.
Yes.
That's interesting because I think that's a perspective that people need to understand to understand why he becomes
Right.
in charge of the church.
I think he's an interesting case because, I think if he had never found the church, he probably would have lived out his life somewhere in upstate New York building mantelpieces and doing bowls and baskets and
He was
and
a
things
very
like
talented
that. He
man.
was very
He
talented.
He could have gone all sorts of directions.
There are apparently still some old homes in upstate New York that boast or claim that they have a Brigham Young mantelpiece or something like
interesting.
that. But he might have just stayed there, and I don't think you would have seen that leadership genius. I won't deny that he had it. I mean, I say there are other sides, but he definitely was that. You wouldn't have seen it, I don't think, unless he had come into the church and found that position where his gifts became obvious.
Right. Well, hey, we're going to take a break.
Okay.
And during the break, we'll play a clip from the movie so people can see it.
Great.
We'll be right back.
Joe Smith thinks he's above the law.
It's our duty to see that the law is obeyed by whatever means we find necessary.
Brigham, what is it?
Joseph and Hiram are dead.
What will we do?
Joseph never discussed who should lead the saints. Men seek for power. The church needs a leader. I'm afraid of who it might be.
Joseph is gone. Hiram, gone. As the last surviving member of the first presidency, it falls on me.
Sidney, I don't care who leads the church, but it won't be you unless God speaks it.
What about my family?
Emma, nothing has changed.
Everything has changed.
I want to weep for a month. I submiss him. I'm not sure what happens next.
There is unrest. You assume that because Joseph is gone, our enemies will leave us alone.
They are too powerful.
The Mormons have called this a war.
We will not be driven from our homes again. We will preach or fight, whichever is required. You will not fail.
Do you see them on top of the temple?
For Israel!
There's talk of 4 or 5 different successors. And so you plot.
He conferred upon our heads all the keys before he was taken away. This child will manage the flock for a season.
We have all done the best we could without Joseph. We will now have to walk by faith, not by sight.
Welcome back to PoliticIt. Of course, we're talking about the 6 Days in August movie. And, during the break, we talked about a few things. One is, we started off with this idea of dealing with Brigham Young and, basically the gift of tongues, right? And that was something that was important to him. You also deal with the polygamy question in here, too.
Yeah, we do. One of the things I wanted to do with this film, and with witnesses, too, is to be thoroughly honest. In witnesses, we had to explain, why did the witnesses leave the church? They didn't just suddenly wake up one morning and say, I think I'll be wicked now. They had grievances. We can see that maybe they weren't totally justified, but they're understandable. Plural marriage was one of those, and it comes up again in 6 Days in August. We can't pretend that it didn't happen. And so there's one scene, I think a very moving scene, where Joseph is with Emma, and Emma is having a really hard time with the burden she has to carry. And so I didn't want to be tested this way. But I think it's a very sympathetic scene. And to understand that, plural marriage was not received with joy by everybody. Obviously, one half of the population was affected in a way the other half wasn't. And but on the other hand, there's another scene where we show Brigham Young and his second wife, Mary Ann Angel, and Hiram Smith and his second wife being introduced to the principle of celestial marriage, that is, eternal marriage, sealings for eternity. And, it doesn't really address polygamy in this life. It doesn't mention that. But the idea of eternal plural marriage is implied, that Hiram will have his first wife, Anne, who's died, and his second wife, and the same with Brigham, because Brigham is depicted in the movie as what he really was. He loved Miriam. It was horrible for him to lose his first wife. And so celestial marriage, eternal marriage is treated there. Some people have said, well, in that scene we show how the women of the church were thrilled by plural marriage. No, it's not really about plural marriage in that scene. It's about eternal marriage.
Right.
It's a different matter. And when we do show plural marriage in this life, Emma is agonizing about it, which is understandable.
Right. Yeah, and another thing I wanted to address a little bit too. This is a high quality movie. This is not a low budget, Johnny Lingo movie, right? This is the. Witnesses was like this, right? This is the introduction of Mormon filmmaking at its best.
Yeah.
Right. So can you talk just a little bit about that and what was going on behind the scenes and how did you pull this off?
Well, I actually have to go back if I may, quite a ways actually, and when I was on, I don't know if it's okay to say, I was serving a mission in Ohio, and I was touched deeply, lifetime-wise, by an article called "The Gospel Vision of the Arts" with Spencer W. Kimball. that so strongly affected me. And I personally have had a desire, and I know many, many people have had that desire. I personally have had a desire to do the kind of quality filmmaking that he talks about. Now, he talks about a lot of other art and different forms of art. But for some reason, it hit me then, and I wasn't even close to being a filmmaker at that point. But it touched me, and I knew that it was something I wanted to accomplish in my lifetime. And I feel like with Witnesses and with 6 Days in August, I feel like I've finally contributed from our end, from my end, something that achieves that quality that's being talked about. So that's really what's driven this. But if you don't tell stories in a quality manner, they will get dismissed. That's my personal feeling. Now, I know that, sorry, I just hit the mic. I apologize.
No, you're good.
So I know that lots of people are doing the very same sort of thing, and in no way do I want to diminish anyone else's efforts. But this is the way we decided to approach it, is to pay attention to the quality. Now, that quality includes the quality of selecting the actors, of casting them. And the key to, one of the biggest keys to making a successful film are to have actors who can actually perform it in a way that is believable, that you see them as the characters they're portraying, not as actors attempting to portray something. But we see Brigham as Brigham, and we see Wilford as Wilford, and Heber as Heber. It comes across that way. It pulls you into the story making, and that's one of the reasons for driving that quality. And so casting was number one. And the other thing is, we could try to make this in Utah, but Utah is a desert.
Right.
And it's to replicate, to give that feeling of the expanse of what's happening, where it happened, and the feeling, all of that has to occur in a place that feels like it could have been Nauvoo, could have been Kirtland, could have been any of the places that the Saints were. And so we went to locations in Canada, upstate New York, near Rochester, in Tennessee. We went to Tennessee because we could find certain elements that we needed there. By the way, I don't know if you know how hard it is to find a team of oxen to get stuck in a mud hole, but
they're not on every corner.
No.
Yeah, and that was a scene that actually was filmed near the end of the movie.
Yeah.
Near the end of the production.
It was one of the very last things that we filmed.
Yeah.
And because we couldn't, anyway, there's a lot more to that story.
So
we saw lots of miracles.
What's the story of you and Dan Peterson and the Interpreter Foundation?
Well,
how did that happen?
It's probably a lot more interesting the way Dan tells it. I love it.
Well, we had talked about doing a film. We did a film, actually, a short film about Robert Kundick, the late Robert Kundick, who was a tabernacle organist and a composer. And my wife and I had gotten to know him and his wife really well in Jerusalem when we were over there. I was teaching at the Jerusalem Center. And we began to ask, so has anybody ever done a movie about you, a profile of you? And his wife said, no, nobody ever has. So we decided to do one. It was eventually shown on BYU TV. It was able to incorporate some of his wonderful work, The Redeemer, right. A wonderful oratorio. And so we really liked that. And I thought, gosh, that turned out really well. I mean, that was actually quality work.
Right.
So then the question is, what else should we do? Eventually, I sent them some material. We were going to do a profile of Richard Anderson, who was the authority on the Witnesses, and his brother Carl Anderson, whom President Hinckley dubbed Mr. Kirtland, who's been the historian of Kirtland, the bishop, the stake president, the patriarch over Kirtland. And I remember you called me up one night and said, Dan, can you come over? And I said, well, yeah, I suppose. What about? He said, well, we need to talk. Well, I'd given them some things to read about the Witnesses, and they were thrilled. And they said, this needs to be a major film. This needs to be an actual movie, not just a short video thing. And well, that was music to my ears because I've always loved the Witnesses and thought they were extraordinarily persuasive. So that's what got us started. And then once that happened, well, we thought, okay, should we do it again? And so we're kind of running this on the model of the Perpetual Emigration Fund or the Perpetual Education Fund. It's not a for-profit venture. We have to go out and raise money for the projects, but then any money that comes in above expenses goes to the next project. That's the idea. Just keep this going. If we can.
And you were quite successful with Witnesses too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, we were pretty successful. It came out during COVID, so there were some limitations on it, but it really helped us toward the next movie, and it also gave us some credibility. I'm frankly amazed when we went to the first person and asked him to support us in making a movie. I'm amazed that he said yes. I mean, I think to myself, here's a couple of bumpkins, Ed Snow and I. Yeah, what do they know about filmmaking?
You know, though, they're pretty good. They're pretty good at squeezing pennies out of people, right?
Well, and we need those pennies to make quality.
But the fact was, people began to support us, and then when the movie is made, you can go now to that and say, look, we've done this. You can see the quality. This is not just pie in the sky. So we're a little more credible now, I hope.
Yeah.
Well, and this particular film, I think, is a crucial one to make, right? I mean, all the stuff that's been thrown at Joseph Smith, it seems like the attacks now were starting to focus on Brigham Young.
They are, yeah. And I'm amazed, even among active members of the church, to hear things that just astonish me. People who say, well, I guess he was the prophet, but he wasn't the Lord's choice. He sort of got there by Machiavellian maneuvering or something.
Yeah.
No. And with some, I've said, look, do you like President Nelson? I love President Nelson. But you don't like Brigham Young? No, can't stand him. Terrible man, horrible, evil. Well, you don't get to have President Nelson without President Young.
Yeah.
The line of apostolic authority goes through August 1844 and flows down to today's prophets and apostles. You can't pick and choose.
Well, and you did a pretty good job of outlining that too. With the scene of Joseph actually passing the keys.
Yes, exactly.
Right before they went to England on the mission, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so and then the reflection back and Brigham Young realizing that that's what had happened.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I think there's a great article by Ron Esplin that came out in 1982, and he's now working on a new article on the same subject for a book that Interpreter will publish. He makes the point that the only real choice in town was Brigham Young and the 12. Sidney Rigdon, the other dissidents who eventually emerged, none of them really would have carried on with the program that Joseph initiated. There were two main elements. Finish the temple. Sidney wasn't so thrilled about that. Sidney'd been basically inactive in the first presidency for about 5 years. And then
you did a good job of illustrating that too, without being exact about it, but you could tell.
He's been dissatisfied. He still is a believer, but not very happy with things. And then he did not want to go west. And that's kind of an odd contradiction. You want to finish the temple and abandon it and go west. But that was Joseph's program, and Brigham and the 12 were committed to that. Sidney wasn't. James Strang eventually wasn't. Joseph III in the reorganization, no temples, no westward migration. People say, well, we would like the church without Brigham Young. You wouldn't have had the church we have without Brigham Young.
Correct.
No temples. We wouldn't be in Utah. I know this is a political broadcast for the most part. The first territorial governor wouldn't have been the territorial governor of Utah. He wouldn't have even been in the Great Basin had that not turned out the way it did in western Illinois in August of 1844.
Well, when they were leaving, I thought that was a unique scene where he goes back and the people are saying, we're not going.
Yeah.
That's exactly
right. They're standing at the temple and they're saying, look,
yeah,
hey, you told us we were going to get endowed before we made this journey.
Right.
I
think it's a crucial scene. Again, we wanted to make the point that Brigham, who is the great organizer, the great practical genius, and he is all of that.
Yeah, the Moses of this dispensation in a lot of ways, right? I mean, that's...
But at the end, what he, you'd think, by practical standards, he should be working on the wagons and getting the pioneer companies ready. What's he doing? He's spending his time in the temple administering the ordinances of the endowment to the saints, because that is what he really is committed to. It's not just colonization for the point of colonization. He wouldn't have been involved in that. He was building the kingdom.
Yeah. And I might add that, Joseph, like Joseph Smith, Brigham Young was about building Zion. And that's crucial to it.
Yeah.
It's absolutely crucial to it.
Well, it's crucial to where we are today, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And I thought emphasizing the temple at the end of the film was a good way to go because we are living in an unprecedented age of temple building. Right?
Oh, my goodness, yes.
So that really makes the point that this flows out of the vision of, in a way, Brigham Young. I mean, one of the last things Brigham does is to administer temple ordinances in Nauvoo. One of the first things he does when he arrives in the Great Basin is to go out with his cane and plant it in the ground and say, here we will build the temple of our God. temples bracketed that westward migration.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we see what's going on right now to that temple.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
This is going to be a fabulous period of time.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
you know, one of the things, I mean, we're about out of time, but you had mentioned when we were talking about some of the things that happened while you were filming this.
Right.
And I think those are inspirational stories that people ought to understand a little bit. Could you just share a few of those with us?
Yes. Boy, there are so many. Let me see if I can kind of briefly touch on some of it. When we were headed to upstate New York, it's called Upper Canada Village, which is on the St. Lawrence River. They started to have major rainstorms come through, and it was incredible. And we thought, how are we going to film this? You know, have a whole movie shot in the rain, it's just depressing and all that sort of stuff. Well, we would head out to set, head out to the location from our hotel. The roads would be wet, it would be raining on our way out, and the rain would clear up. It happened day after day after day. The same thing happened in New York, near Rochester at Genesee Country Village. It would happen. And we were on a tight schedule. And Mark and James, other producers and directors, were really, there's a lot of, how are we going to make this all work? And rain also slows you down. Well, as this continued on, one of what's called a grip, one of our gentlemen who is from the New York area, he's out, spends a lot of time outside, more than even the rest of us, and he's looking at his phone, he's always following the weather patterns, and he said, he went to one of the, I think it was a returned missionary, one of the other people on the crew, and said, what is happening? He said, it is like the storms come, they either dissipate or they go around us. He's watching this on his phone, and he wanted to know what was happening. And there were other miracles. That weather blessing again happened when we were in Tennessee. All of a sudden the rains were going to come in, and it was raining hard, and then we would go out to set and it would clear up. Except for our very last day in Tennessee, we had one more scene to do, and it's the scene where Heber and Brigham are talking about him marrying Mary Ann Angel. And we had that planned for another location. We're going to do it in the morning. It was a location nearby, and the whole setting would have been different, and it poured rain. And this was the one scene where we didn't have to match anything else. Well, doing that in the rain made it a more intimate, just a more powerful scene. And even the actors have commented to us on how having the rain there. And so it's so very interesting how the miracle of all the weather has worked out. But for me, and I shared this at the premiere, one of the biggest miracles, as you can imagine, getting an army of people together to make a film of this quality. You have different opinions about things, but there was something really special happening with this team, who are members, non-members, from all walks of life. They came together, and I spent a lot of time on set. I was probably there on set during filming probably 95% of the time, if not more than that. But most interesting thing was that there was no contention. If you've ever been on a film set around creative people, there's always something. But I never saw any contention, and it was miraculous itself. And I think it led to a lot of these other things. And I could tell you more. I mean, there is one other story where we needed, for the scene where Joseph and Hiram are headed off to Carthage, they're hauled away basically under arrest. We needed a number of horses for that scene. And at 8 o'clock the night before we were supposed to film that scene, all hopes of those horses showing up disappeared. And what are we going to do? And I won't go into the details, but at 9 p.m., 1 hour later, we had them back. We had horses available to us at the last moment. And we needed 6, we actually ended up with 7. And that happened with wagons and just little tiny miracles that all add up to a really powerful experience.
Well, you know, one miracle that I kind of saw in a way, these people that you got to act in this film, there was something special about them.
Oh, and that goes to all of them. I talked earlier about how casting is really important, but another really important part about casting, and Mark Goodman, the director, he is really focused on casting and very good about it. And he and James Jordan and myself, we all give input into that casting. But there was another thing that happened, is they put their arms literally around one another, and particularly our gentleman who plays Brigham Young, John Donovan Wilson, and his wife Twyla Wilson, who, when we cast them, by the way, we didn't know were married, but they were married in actual life. They are just great at putting their arms around people and other cast members and bringing them in and just making them part of the family. And that closeness, I think, also contributed to the quality of their performances. They genuinely liked each other offset, so it made it so much easier to show that on camera.
Yeah.
And if I may add something there, you know, in choosing the actors, we basically looked at audition tapes and so on, and they did really well. The Brigham Young character did really well with. Mark threw him a really difficult thing, the speaking in tongues, to see how he'd react. And most of the actors who tried out were just awful. And he did brilliantly with it. Looked like he was receiving revelation right there. But we didn't test them for articulateness, you know, away from a script or anything like that. And yet what we got with Paul Wuthrich as Joseph Smith, Camry Fox as Emma in Witnesses, and now again in this, and then Twyla Wilson as Marianne Angel and John Donovan Wilson as Brigham Young, we got 4 people who are willing and able to go out very articulately and explain what their faith means to them, what it meant to play these characters. And I remember the first time hearing Paul speak, I was sitting next to him, someone asked him a question, and I turned to him and thought, my word, he's good. He's really good. Yeah. He's thought about these things. He's a believer and an articulate believer. Now, that's a bonus that I don't know that we deserve it, but we got it.
Yeah. Right. Well, I remember Heather and I coming to one of your events that you held and they were both there.
Yeah.
And that was inspiring to hear their stories, hear how they had left New York, come back here, didn't know what they were going to do, but yet this just worked out for them.
Yeah, it really did.
And that's amazing. So we're out of time. I want to play another clip at the end, if that's okay. But
love that.
But why should people go watch this movie?
I think they ought to watch it because they'll learn things they don't know. They'll see a side of Brigham Young that they have not seen, probably. They will learn an appreciation for that process, for the process by which our current mode of apostolic leadership in the church emerged. And I think they'll be inspired. I think they'll learn to love some of those characters. And I want them to know that we did not invent any major scenes in this movie. This is real history. You know, you invent dialogue here and there because we don't know there was no one there transcribing it or anything. But these personalities emerge out of history, out of the historical record. And I believe that people will come out of it loving those leaders and with strengthened testimonies of the church as we now have it.
Oh,
I hope they come out inspired.
Yeah.
I believe they will.
Yeah, very good. Go watch this movie, guys. Thank you. Thanks for coming in, and we'll play one more clip at the end if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Great to see you guys. We'll see you next week.
What do you suppose he will be like?
No idea. He's probably readying a sermon.
We're looking for the prophet Joseph. I hope you are not disappointed.
You're exactly as we imagined.
I doubt that. Come on, Joseph, come on!
Come on, Brigham!
You are most welcome by my side anytime, Brigham. Something is brewing. You have many storms to pass through.
Come back to me.
That I will do.
Hurrah for Israel!
You claim to be God's people, yet trouble follows you everywhere.
We will not be driven from our homes again. We will preach or fight, whichever is required.
They are too powerful.
The shrub will persecute the saints so long as he draws breath.
To the end of the Mormons.
They are threatening arrest. And we're looking for Joseph Smith.
We will prove your innocence.
Brigham,
What is it?
Joseph and Hiram are dead. Joseph never discussed who should lead the saints.
There's talk of 4 or 5 different successors.
Sidney, I don't care who leads the church, but it won't be you unless God speaks it. I want to weep for a month, I submissive.
You will not fail.
I'm not sure what happens next.
We will now have to walk by faith, not by sight.